There exists in the shadowed hierarchies of hell a prince whose dominion extends not through violence, not through seduction, but through something far more insidious. He does not need fangs or flames. He does not require incantations whispered in darkness. His weapon is desire itself, the gnawing hunger that lives in every human heart, the yearning for more, always more. They call him Mammon, the Lord of Greed, and his story begins not with a name, but with a warning. Picture yourself standing on a hillside in ancient Judea. The air smells of wild grass and distant cooking fires. Before you, a teacher speaks to a gathering crowd, his words cutting through the afternoon heat with unexpected sharpness. No one can serve two masters, he declares, his voice carrying across the slope. You cannot serve both God and Mammon. The crowd shifts uncomfortably. They know what Mammon means. Wealth, riches, the accumulation of earthly treasure. But there's something in the way this teacher speaks the word, as if he's not just describing money, but naming an adversary, as if Mammon were not merely a thing, but a being, something with intention, something with power. This moment marks the beginning of one of history's most fascinating transformations. Over the next 15 centuries, that simple Aramaic word for wealth would undergo a metamorphosis so complete, so thoroughly embedded in Western consciousness, that millions would come to believe in Mammon not as a metaphor for greed, but as an actual demon, a fallen angel with dominion over human avarice, one of the 7 princes of hell itself. The journey from common noun to infernal royalty reveals something profound about how humans understand evil, how we personify our deepest temptations, and why sometimes our greatest monsters are the ones that wear the most seductive masks. The story of Mammon's transformation begins in the ancient markets and counting houses of the Near East, where the Aramaic-speaking peoples of first-century Palestine conducted their daily commerce. The word mamona rolled off tongues as naturally as any other term for property or possessions. It meant, quite simply, wealth, the tangible riches that could be accumulated, counted, and displayed. There was nothing supernatural about it, nothing inherently sinister. It was as mundane as saying money or property in our own language. Yet, even in its original context, the word carried subtle undertones. The Aramaic mamona derives from a root that scholars trace to the concept of that in which one trusts. Here, embedded in the very etymology, lies the seed of its later transformation, not merely money, but the trust one places in material wealth. Not simply possessions, but the security one seeks through accumulation. The word itself contained a philosophical tension, wealth as object versus wealth as object of devotion. When the Gospel writers recorded Jesus' teachings in Greek, they made a curious choice. Instead of translating mamona into Greek words for wealth, plutos or chromata, they transliterated it directly as mammonas. This decision preserved the Aramaic term's particular flavor, its specific connotation. Later, when Jerome translated the Gospels into Latin for his Vulgate Bible in the 4th century, he maintained this tradition, rendering it as mammona. By the time English translators approached the text for the King James Bible in 1611, the word had become so familiar in its untranslated form that they simply carried it forward. Mammon. This linguistic journey accomplished something remarkable. By refusing translation, by preserving the word in its original form across languages and centuries, the Church inadvertently transformed mammon from a common noun into something resembling a proper noun. It became not merely a word for wealth, but a specific entity, the mammon. And proper nouns, as any student of mythology knows, can easily become personified. They can become names. The earliest Christian theologians recognized this possibility immediately. Gregory of Nyssa, writing in the 4th century, went so far as to equate Mammon with Beelzebub, suggesting they were different names for the same demonic entity. Here, we see the first explicit identification of Mammon as a demon rather than an abstraction. John Chrysostom, whose eloquent preaching earned him the epithet golden-mouthed, personified Mammon as the very embodiment of greed itself. He described it not as money corrupting the soul, but as a spiritual force actively working to enslave humanity. These early church fathers lived in a Roman Empire where mystery religions flourished, where people routinely personified abstract concepts as gods and goddesses. Fortune was fortuna. Victory was victoria. Abundance was abundantia. In this cultural context, personifying mammon as a demonic force opposed to God made perfect theological and rhetorical sense. If greed could be portrayed as an enemy general commanding legions against the soul, Christians would fight it more fiercely than if it were merely a vice to avoid. But the true transformation of mammon from personified concept to actual demon would occur during the medieval period, when European theologians constructed elaborate hierarchies of hell that would shape Western demonology for centuries to come. The Middle Ages operated under a worldview that modern minds struggle to fully grasp. To medieval Christians, the supernatural realm was not distant or abstract. It was immediate, pressing, and terrifyingly real. Demons walked the earth, whispering temptations into receptive ears. Angels watched from heaven. Every natural disaster, every illness, every temptation carried potential spiritual significance. In this atmosphere of heightened, supernatural awareness, the cataloging and classification of hell's inhabitants became a matter of urgent importance. If demons were real and actively working to damn souls, then understanding their hierarchies, their particular methods, their individual areas of expertise could provide crucial intelligence in the cosmic war between good and evil. Medieval theologians approached demonology with the same systematic rigor they applied to philosophy and natural science. They sought to map hell as meticulously as cartographers mapped the known world. Peter Lombard, the influential 12th century theologian whose sentences became a standard textbook for medieval universities, wrote definitively, "Riches are called by the name of a devil, namely, Mammon, for Mammon is the name of a devil, by which name riches are called according to the Syrian tongue." Notice the progression in his statement. Riches are called by a devil's name because Mammon is a devil whose name became synonymous with wealth. The abstraction has become entity. The metaphor has solidified into reality. This wasn't merely theoretical speculation. Medieval preachers invoked Mammon by name in sermons, warning congregations about the demon who specialized in corrupting through wealth. The 14th century poem Piers Plowman treats Mammon explicitly as a deity, a spiritual force with agency and intention. Nicholas de Lyra, one of the most respected biblical commentators of the Middle Ages, stated flatly in his gloss on Luke's Gospel, "Mammon est nomen daemonis." Mammon is the name of a demon. The systematic classification of demons reached new heights with Alfonso de Spina's Fortalitium Fidei in 1467. This Spanish monk organized hell's inhabitants into 10 distinct categories, and within his schema, Mammon occupied a position of particular importance. One of the demons who specifically attacked saints and holy people. This detail is crucial. Mammon wasn't depicted as a minor tempter preying on the already corrupt. He was portrayed as powerful enough to assault even the most spiritually fortified individuals, suggesting a demon of considerable rank and capability. But the classification that would cement Mammon's place in popular consciousness came from an unlikely source, a German witch hunter whose brutal methods would make his name synonymous with religious persecution. Peter Binsfeld, auxiliary bishop of Trier in the late 16th century, was responsible for some of the bloodiest witch trials in European history. Between 1581 and 1593, hundreds of people were tortured and executed in the territories under his jurisdiction, many based on confessions extracted through methods that Binsfeld himself defended as necessary and appropriate. In 1589, Binsfeld published his Treatise on Confessions by Evildoers and Witches, and within its pages appeared a classification system that would profoundly influence Western occultism. Binsfeld organized the primary demons of hell according to the 7 deadly sins, creating what became known as the 7 princes of hell. Each prince governed a particular vice, commanding legions of lesser demons in the eternal work of human corruption. Lucifer ruled pride, the sin that had caused his own fall. Satan commanded wrath, embodying divine punishment turned destructive. Leviathan controlled envy, the serpentine demon of covetous comparison. Beelzebub presided over gluttony, the lord of flies corrupting through excess. Belphegor governed sloth, offering ease and negligence. Asmodeus commanded lust, the demon of distorted desire. And Mammon ruled greed, the insatiable hunger for wealth and worldly power. This wasn't merely an academic exercise. Binsfeld's classification provided witch hunters with a systematic framework for interrogation. If a suspected witch showed particular interest in wealth, that suggested the influence of Mammon. Confessions could be shaped around these categories, creating self-fulfilling prophecies of demonic influence. The classification also served a pedagogical function. By assigning a specific demon to each sin, preachers could make their warnings more concrete, more frightening, more memorable. What's particularly fascinating about Binsfeld's system is how it differed from earlier classifications. An anonymous English Lollard tract from 1409 called The Lantern of Light had already associated 7 demons with 7 sins, and it too named Mammon as the prince of avarice. But where that earlier list placed Beelzebub as the demon of envy and Belphegor as the demon of gluttony, Binsfeld rearranged the hierarchy, creating the alignment that would become standard in later occult literature. The 7 princes concept carried enormous theological weight. These weren't mere demons. They were hell's aristocracy, fallen angels of such power and rank that they commanded millions of lesser spirits. Medieval demonologists calculated that Mammon alone controlled 6,660,000 demons, an army of greed sowing avarice throughout the world. Every merchant who cheated his customers, every miser hoarding gold while others starved, every ambitious soul sacrificing moral principle for material gain, all were thought to be under Mammon's influence, whether they knew it or not. But who was Mammon really? What did he look like? How did he operate? For answers to these questions, we must turn to the poets and storytellers who gave flesh to theological abstraction. No demon truly lives until literature breathes life into it, and Mammon's literary incarnations reveal how profoundly he captured the medieval and Renaissance imagination. 2 works in particular shaped popular understanding of Mammon's nature: Edmund Spenser's epic allegorical poem, The Faerie Queene, and John Milton's Paradise Lost. Each presented Mammon in ways that would define his character for centuries. Spenser's Faerie Queene, published in 1590 and dedicated to Queen Elizabeth I, undertook an ambitious project to create an English epic that would rival the classical works of Homer and Virgil, while serving as an elaborate moral allegory. Each book of the poem followed a different knight on a quest to embody a particular virtue. Book 2 chronicles Sir Gawain, the Knight of Temperance, whose trials include a harrowing descent into the cave of Mammon. This episode represents one of the most vivid depictions of Mammon ever committed to verse. Spenser presents him not as an abstract force, but as a fully realized character, a grotesque figure dwelling in an underground realm that parodies both classical underworlds and earthly treasuries. Mammon appears to Gawain as he travels through a desert wilderness, and the demon's physical description is telling. He's covered in soot and grime from digging in the earth, his fingers like claws, his appearance suggesting someone who has spent eternity grubbing in dirt for hidden treasure. But the cave of Mammon itself, that's where Spenser's genius truly shines. The knight descends into a vast subterranean complex, where Mammon oversees the mining, smelting, and hoarding of precious metals. Golden statues of ancient kings line the halls, monuments to rulers who served Mammon during their earthly reigns. The demon offers Gawain infinite wealth, political power, anything his heart might desire. All the knight needs do is reach out and take it. What makes this scene so psychologically astute is how Mammon tempts. He doesn't threaten or frighten. He simply displays his wealth and offers it freely. The corruption lies not in the taking itself, but in the wanting, in the moment when desire takes root in the heart. Gawain resists, but barely, and Spenser makes clear that the real danger isn't the gold, but the hunger for it. Mammon's cave is a test of the soul's fortitude against its own covetousness. Spenser's depiction established several conventions that would persist in later portrayals of Mammon. First, the association between Mammon and underground spaces, caves, mines, the buried treasures of the earth. This connected the demon to both classical underworlds and the very real practice of mining, which medieval and Renaissance Europeans viewed with deep ambivalence. Mining violated the earth, ripped open her body to extract wealth. It was an act of violation that perfectly symbolized greed's destructive nature. Second, Spencer presented Mammon as possessing ancient authority. The demon claims to have taught humans how to extract and work metals, making him responsible for both technological advancement and the corruption that followed. This detail linked Mammon to Prometheus-like figures who gave dangerous knowledge to humanity, knowledge that brought both benefit and curse. If Spencer gave Mammon his most elaborate visual representation, John Milton gave him his most psychologically complex portrait. Paradise Lost, published in 1667, represents the zenith of English epic poetry, a 12-book narrative retelling the fall of Satan and the subsequent fall of man. Among the fallen angels who followed Lucifer in his rebellion, Mammon occupies a distinctive position. Milton introduces him with devastating economy. Mammon, the least erected spirit that fell from heaven. That phrase, least erected, works on multiple levels. Physically, it describes Mammon's posture. Even in heaven, before the fall, Mammon walked with eyes downcast, studying the golden pavement beneath his feet rather than looking up at divine glory. His attention was always on the material, the tangible, the valuable substance, rather than the transcendent spirit. This physical description carries profound theological implications. Mammon cannot look up. His very nature prevents him from perceiving higher truths. He is literally bent toward material things, his posture reflecting his spiritual condition. After the fall, when the demons gather to build Pandemonium, their capital city in hell, Mammon leads the engineering project. His intimate knowledge of metallurgy and mining allows him to direct the extraction of gold from hell's hills and the construction of a palace that rivals anything in heaven, at least in superficial splendor. Milton presents Mammon's expertise as a perversion of divine creativity. Where God creates ex nihilo from nothing, Mammon can only extract and reshape what already exists. His is the skill of exploitation, not creation. The magnificent palace he builds represents the ultimate monument to greed. Beautiful on the surface, hollow at the core, a structure designed to impress rather than inspire. In the great debate among the fallen angels about how to respond to their defeat, Mammon delivers a speech that reveals his essential character. He argues against further war with heaven, but not out of wisdom or humility. Instead, he proposes that the demons should focus on making hell comfortable, extracting its resources to build an alternative paradise that might rival heaven in material splendor, if not spiritual glory. His solution to damnation is capitalistic. Improve the real estate, develop the infrastructure, create wealth even in perdition. Other demons recognize the bankruptcy of this vision. Beelzebub dismisses it. Mammon's tragedy, as C.S. Lewis later observed, is that he never understood the difference between hell and heaven. He thinks the gap is merely one of resources rather than essence. Give him enough gold, enough building materials, enough time to develop hell's economy, and he believes he can create a perfectly acceptable substitute for divine presence. It's the ultimate expression of materialist philosophy, the belief that all problems can be solved through sufficient accumulation of resources. Milton's Mammon also embodies a particularly Protestant concern about the corruption of religious institutions through wealth. Writing in the aftermath of the English Civil War and the struggle between Protestant and Catholic visions of Christianity, Milton clearly associates Mammon with ornate church decoration, with the material splendor of religious buildings that, in his view, distracted from true spiritual worship. The magnificent temple Mammon builds in hell parodies the grand cathedrals of Catholic Europe, suggesting that such structures represented victories for greed rather than demonstrations of faith. Both Spencer and Milton established the iconography that would dominate subsequent depictions of Mammon in art and literature. He appears bent over, eyes downcast, surrounded by piles of gold and precious stones. Sometimes he's depicted as a grotesque figure, deformed by his eternal grubbing in the earth. Other times he appears deceptively magnificent, dressed in rich robes and dripping with jewelry. wealth used as disguise for his spiritual poverty. Victorian artists particularly favored the latter interpretation. George Frederick Watts's 1884 painting, Mammon, shows a colossal figure crushing human victims beneath his feet while reaching for gold, embodying the industrial capitalism that was transforming Britain. The demon had evolved from a medieval theological concept into a critique of contemporary economic systems. Understanding Mammon's power requires recognizing what makes him unique among hell's princes. Moloch corrupts through violence and blood sacrifice. Asmodeus works through sexual obsession. Leviathan breeds envy and resentment, but Mammon's method, is more subtle, more patient, more insidious. He doesn't assault the soul. He purchases it on the installment plan. Medieval theologians recognized that Mammon posed a particular danger because his temptations appeared so reasonable. Wanting financial security isn't evil. Desiring comfort for your family isn't sinful. Working to improve your material circumstances can be entirely virtuous. The corruption comes in degrees so gradual that the victim doesn't recognize the transformation until it's complete. Thomas Aquinas, the great Dominican philosopher whose work shaped Catholic theology for centuries, described avarice, Mammon's special province, as a unique sin because it increased rather than decreased with age. While the lusts of youth might fade with time, greed only intensified. The more wealth one accumulated, the more one feared losing it, and the more one wanted to acquire. Avarice created a self-reinforcing cycle of desire and anxiety that trapped the soul more securely than any chains. Aquinas metaphorically described this process as Mammon being carried up from hell by a wolf, coming to inflame the human heart with greed. The wolf imagery is significant. Wolves in medieval bestiaries represented insatiable hunger, creatures that could never be satisfied no matter how much they consumed. Mammon rides this creature of endless appetite, using it to kindle similar hunger in human hearts. The mechanism of Mammon's corruption follows a predictable pattern. First comes a seed of legitimate desire, wanting to provide for one's family, achieve security, gain independence through wealth. This desire is natural, even praiseworthy in moderate form, but Mammon nurtures it, whispers encouragement, points out opportunities for profit. The desire grows from wanting enough to wanting more, from more to wanting most, from most to wanting all. As the desire intensifies, it begins to warp other values. Corners get cut in business dealings. Family time gets sacrificed for additional work. Charitable obligations feel burdensome. Gradually, imperceptibly, the pursuit of wealth moves from means to end, from tool to master. The person believes they're still in control, still working toward that original legitimate goal. But the goalposts have moved. There's always one more deal, one more acquisition, one more investment before they'll have enough. Medieval moralists particularly emphasized how Mammon corrupted judgment. The wealthy merchant convinced himself that his sharp dealing was just good business, the miser persuading himself that his hoarding was prudent savings, the ambitious noble certain that his ruthless accumulation of power served the greater good. Mammon's special gift was helping people rationalize their greed, dressing it in the language of virtue. The demon also worked through social pressure and comparison. Medieval society, despite its official condemnation of avarice, operated on increasingly complex financial systems. Banking, credit, international trade, all required sophisticated engagement with wealth. The merchant who refused to employ Mammon's methods would find himself outcompeted by rivals less scrupulous. The nobleman who didn't maximize his estate's revenue would lose political influence to wealthier peers. This created what modern economists might call a collective action problem. Even people who recognized greed's spiritual dangers felt compelled to participate in its systems. Mammon didn't need to personally corrupt every individual. He simply needed to create social and economic structures where ethical behavior became economically punishing. The system itself became the temptation. Theologians also warned about Mammon's special affinity for corrupting the holy. While demons like Moloch obviously opposed divine will, Mammon could disguise his work as serving God. Medieval chronicles are filled with stories of monasteries that accumulated vast wealth ostensibly to serve the poor, but actually to aggrandize themselves, of churches built with such expense and splendor that the money might have fed thousands, of holy offices sold to the highest bidder, turning spiritual authority into commercial commodity. This corruption of religious institutions through wealth particularly horrified reformers. When Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg, his central complaint targeted the sale of indulgences, the Catholic Church literally selling spiritual benefits for cash. Luther saw this as mammon triumphant, greed disguised as piety, the demon enthroned in the very heart of Christendom. The Protestant Reformation's emphasis on simplicity and worship, on stripped-down churches and rejection of ornate ritual, represented in part a deliberate assault on Mammon's influence. If the demon worked through material display and accumulated wealth, then poverty and plainness became spiritual weapons. The bare wooden pews of a Protestant meeting house stood in conscious opposition to the gilded altars of Catholic cathedrals. But Mammon adapted as capitalism emerged and markets became the dominant organizing principle of European society. The demon found new vehicles for his influence. The Dutch Golden Age, with its merchant wealth and elaborate financial instruments, saw prosperity intermixed with warnings about spiritual corruption through materialism. English Puritans preached against worldliness while building trading empires. The cognitive dissonance was stunning. How did one participate in economic systems driven by profit-seeking while maintaining spiritual purity? The answer, many decided, was that wealth itself wasn't evil. Material prosperity could even be a sign of divine favor, evidence that God blessed the industrious and virtuous. The pursuit of profit was acceptable as long as it was directed toward godly ends and didn't become an obsession. This theological compromise allowed for the development of capitalism within a Christian framework, but it also created enormous space for self-deception. Mammon no longer needed to appear as a demon offering bags of gold. He could work through the respectable mechanisms of market economies, through the patient accumulation of compound interest, through the socially celebrated ambition to rise in wealth and status. The demon had successfully embedded himself in the very structure of modern life. By the Victorian era, Mammon had transcended his origins as a demon of Christian theology to become a broader symbol of industrial capitalism's dehumanizing effects. Thomas Carlyle, the Scottish philosopher and historian, coined the term Gospel of Mammonism to describe what he saw as Britain's worship of wealth and material progress at the expense of human dignity and spiritual values. Carlyle's 1843 work, Past and Present, contrasted medieval England's feudal society, with all its flaws and injustices, against industrial Britain's treatment of workers as mere economic inputs. He saw in the factories and workhouses, in the reduction of human relationships to cash transactions, the complete victory of Mammon over all competing values. Money had become the measure of all things, the universal solvent that dissolved traditional bonds of obligation and care. The critique resonated because it articulated a widespread anxiety. Industrialization had produced unprecedented wealth, but distributed it with shocking inequality. Factory workers labored in brutal conditions while their employers built palatial estates. Children worked in coal mines while the coal barons lived in luxury. The very landscape was being transformed. Pastoral countryside replaced by smoking factories, ancient forests cut down for lumber, rivers polluted by industrial waste, all in service to profit, to the endless accumulation of capital that seemed to have become society's primary purpose. American progressives and populists of the late 19th and early 20th centuries adopted Mammon as shorthand for Wall Street banks and corporate monopolies. The concentrated wealth and power of industrial magnates, the Rockefellers, Morgans, Carnegies, appeared to represent exactly the kind of soul-corrupting materialism that medieval theologians had warned against, except now the corruption was systematic, structural, built into the very foundations of economic life. Upton Sinclair, the muckraking journalist whose exposés revealed horrifying conditions in meat-packing plants and other industries, specifically invoked Mammon in his work. The demon, he suggested, had succeeded beyond medieval demonologists' wildest nightmares. Mammon didn't need to tempt individuals anymore. He had constructed entire economic systems that forced people to serve greed whether they wanted to or not. This transformation of Mammon from theological concept to social critique represented something profound. The demon had escaped his Christian context to become a universal symbol for the dehumanizing effects of capitalism. The way market logic could reduce human beings to economic units. The process by which everything, labor, land, relationships, even human life itself, becomes commodity. Yet, even as Mammon was secularized and universalized, his theological dimensions persisted. Churches continued to preach against materialism and greed. Christian socialists argued that capitalism itself was inherently demonic, that a system organized around profit-seeking must necessarily serve Mammon rather than God. The social gospel movement sought to apply Christian ethics to economic relationships, to build a society that valued human dignity over market efficiency. In our contemporary world, Mammon remains disturbingly relevant. Consumer culture operates on the cultivation of desire, the creation of perpetual dissatisfaction that can only be temporarily assuaged through purchase. Advertising exists to make people want things they didn't know they needed. The entire apparatus of modern marketing represents a systematic effort to inflame greed, to transform humans into insatiable consumers. The financial crisis of 2008 revealed how thoroughly Mammon's logic had penetrated even the most sophisticated economic institutions. Banks that were supposedly too big to fail had engaged in reckless speculation driven purely by profit. Financial instruments so complex that even their creators didn't fully understand them were sold to unsuspecting investors. When the house of cards collapsed, ordinary people lost jobs and homes, while the architects of the crisis walked away wealthy. The demon had won again, not through supernatural intervention, but through perfectly legal, even celebrated, economic behavior. The system itself had become the temptation, just as medieval theologians had warned. Climate change presents perhaps the ultimate test of humanity's relationship with Mammon. The scientific evidence is overwhelming. Continuing to burn fossil fuels will produce catastrophic environmental damage, but fossil fuel corporations have known about this danger for decades and actively work to obscure and deny it, prioritizing short-term profits over long-term survival. They serve Mammon so thoroughly that they're willing to risk civilizational collapse rather than accept reduced earnings. This is greed elevated to theological proportions, the worship of wealth taken to its logical conclusion. And yet, it's accomplished through quarterly earnings reports, shareholder meetings, and lobbying campaigns. Mammon doesn't need horns and a tail anymore. He wears a business suit and speaks the language of fiduciary responsibility. The persistence of Mammon, both as theological concept and cultural symbol, suggests something fundamental about human nature and social organization. We seem perpetually susceptible to the confusion of means and ends, to mistaking wealth for well-being, to believing that enough accumulation will finally satisfy the hunger. Every generation rediscovers this truth, and every generation largely ignores it. Medieval demonologists classified Mammon as one of the 7 princes of hell because they recognized greed as one of humanity's most persistent and destructive impulses. They were right. The demon they described, whether understood literally or metaphorically, names a real force in human affairs, a pattern of corruption that repeats across centuries and cultures. And that force hasn't diminished. If anything, it's grown stronger, more sophisticated, more deeply embedded in the structures of modern life. Mammon doesn't need to tempt us with treasure chests anymore. He's built an entire civilization on the principle that greed is good, that self-interest properly channeled produces optimal outcomes, that the pursuit of profit serves everyone's interests. The question isn't whether Mammon exists as a literal demon commanding legions of lesser spirits. The question is whether the pattern of corruption named by that figure, the reduction of human values to monetary values, the elevation of wealth above all other goods, the transformation of society into a mechanism for profit extraction, whether that pattern dominates our world. And if we're honest, we know the answer. We've followed Mammon's journey from a simple Aramaic word for wealth to one of the most enduring figures in Western demonology. We've seen how early Christian theologians personified him how medieval scholars classified him among hell's aristocracy, how Renaissance poets gave him vivid literary life, and how modern critics transformed him into a symbol of capitalism's excesses. But what makes Mammon's story particularly fascinating is how it illuminates the relationship between material and spiritual life, between economics and ethics, between the legitimate need for resources and the corrupting pursuit of wealth. Every society must grapple with these tensions. Every individual faces the question of how much is enough. The demon of greed persists because the temptation of greed persists. As long as humans organize societies, create economies, and make choices about resource distribution, Mammon will remain relevant. Whether we conceive of him as a literal fallen angel or as a metaphorical representation of destructive patterns, the core insight remains true. Unchecked desire for wealth corrupts individuals, distorts societies, and creates suffering. The medieval theologians who systematized demonology weren't engaged in abstract speculation. They were attempting to map the spiritual landscape, to identify the forces that worked against human flourishing. They named Mammon as a prince of hell because they witnessed his effects. Communities torn apart by greed, leaders corrupted by wealth, churches compromised by money, souls hollowed out by avarice. We witness the same effects today, different contexts, different mechanisms, but the same fundamental corruption. Mammon adapts to every era, finds expression in every economic system, speaks the language of whatever age he inhabits. That adaptability makes him dangerous. That persistence makes him relevant. So, when you encounter the name Mammon, whether in medieval grimoires or modern economic critiques, remember that you're confronting something that transcends simple definition. You're facing a question that every human society must answer. What value do we place on wealth? What are we willing to sacrifice to obtain it? At what point does the pursuit of prosperity become its own form of poverty? The demon of greed whispers that there's never enough, that more is always better, that wealth can solve all problems, that we can serve both God and mammon, both values and profits, both people and portfolios. Medieval demonologists knew better, and perhaps we should learn from their wisdom. If you found this exploration of one of hell's princes enlightening, please like and subscribe for more deep dives into the fascinating world of mythology, demonology, and the enduring questions of human nature. The hierarchy of hell holds many more secrets, and each demon reveals something profound about the temptations and trials that define human existence. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and remember, the most dangerous demons are often the ones we invite in ourselves.